Community Forum is sponsored by the Easton Grange 196 and a friend of Yardley Wood Rink and the Easton Lions Club.
There's a storm across the valley. The clouds are rolling in. The afternoon is heavy on your shoulders. There's a truck out on the 4-lane, a mile or more away. The whining of his wheels just makes it colder.
Welcome to Community Forum. Today is May 15th, 2024. I'm Priscilla Almquist Olsen, your host, and today it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Ed Hands, town historian, to the program, and we're going to talk about Swift's Park. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you for having me. Of course, coming up at town meeting is the big vote on whether to fund a expansion of the park. It's a small expansion, but a big change. And I apologize that my co-chair of the Swiss Park Committee can't make it today, but he had some automotive problems and he's stuck someplace.
He's stuck someplace. Yeah. We don't know where. And that would be John Ventresco, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe you can talk a little bit about what he would share with us.
Well, John's the person that has the details about the money and things like that. So forgive me if I make a slip there, but I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about why there is a Swift's Park right now.
Great.
And that's because way back in 1918, we had this terrible flu pandemic. And somewhere between 25 and 50 people died in Easton between September of 1918 and January or February of 1919, which was a large number of people given the population at the time, which was around 5,000. Private Swift was in the service down in Texas, serving as a medical orderly when he contracted the flu and died. He was one of 3 people we could qualify as first responders who died during the pandemic. That's not something that happened during COVID, but the other one was Minnie Nystrom, who was a young lady from Northeastern who just got out of nursing school down in Rhode Island and was serving in a hospital there trying to treat people. And she contracted the flu and died. And then I consider a broader definition of first responders. So I would include Father James Ryan of Immaculate Conception, who contracted the flu doing his duties and passed away as well. And a number of other people who were serving as nurses or medical orderlies came very close, including Olivia Ames from Sheep Pasture. She contracted the flu and almost died. So in 1934, relatives of Private Swift donated the land that's now Swift's Park in Furnace Village in his honor. And the deed is very strict that it can only be used for park purposes.
And can you tell us exactly where that's located?
Yeah, where Furnace Village is. Not everybody knows because the traditional neighborhoods are sort of blurring together now.
Well, I know where Furnace Village is, but I'd like to know the street address.
Yep, absolutely. And it's Swiss Park is at the junction of Foundry Street and Pequannock. It's that intersection that you don't want to try to be pulling out of Pequannock and taking a turn up to Target because it's a real tough turn. In fact, going the other way is even worse. One of the things that is changing down there is that the developer of the 40 houses across the street at the old Foundry site is going to be paying for a light, which should be going in this year. So there will be a stoplight there and a crosswalk, which will make it a much safer place to go for a walk and also give people a chance to slow down a little bit and see how beautiful this park is going to be. So Furnace Village is, in my way of thinking as a historian, the second most important historical neighborhood of the town. It's hard to beat Northeastern with its Richardson buildings. But as far as contributions to American history, Furnace Village is second to none. It's the only place in town where we have a primary source that says on April 19th, 1775, somebody came to the foundry and called out the militia from there to march to Boston up Bay Road. So that's really the start of first responders for America. And the other interesting thing is that, two other interesting things is that during the Revolutionary War, cannonballs and cannon were made for the Revolutionary Army and also for privateer ships that were an important supplement to our Navy. And then the other important thing is that all the wonderful technology we have today, including these beautiful cameras, are all the results of the Industrial Revolution and the development of interchangeable parts. And it turns out that the foundry at Furnace Village made some of the very first interchangeable parts for the textile mills in Lowell, which is generally considered to be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. So there's a lot of cool history attached there. I could go on about some of the other details, but I want to talk about why we're proposing this at this point. And you may remember that back in 2020 and 21, there was the COVID epidemic, and that was very terrible as well. There's two ways that you can count deaths in a pandemic. One is to simply go to the Board of Health and get the list of people who passed away. And it will say influenza or COVID. And our records are very good for both, but the designation for deaths related to COVID waited a while because initially you couldn't be officially diagnosed with COVID unless you had lung samples taken and things like this. And then later on, it was like, oh, here's a person who suddenly died. We'll call it COVID. So it gets a little blurry. The way that historians have been doing this is through something called excess death. You take an average of the 5 years before a pandemic and compare the average number of deaths in a town to what happens during the pandemic. And it's very interesting, I think, that there were 45 excess deaths in Easton in 1918 caused by the flu or related to the flu. And in both 2020 and 2021, and even in 2022, there were 45 excess deaths a year, which we can probably attribute to COVID. So in reality, more people died from COVID than in Easton than died from the 1918 flu, but it was over a longer period. So the impact wasn't as obvious. Many people in town have lost relatives, and one of the nice things about our park proposal is it will give folks an opportunity to get a paver in honor of a relative. It doesn't have to be a relative who passed away. I had a cousin who passed away out on Ohio, but the thing that kind of got me thinking about improving our park was not his death, which was one of many hundreds of thousands in the country, but the way he was treated. And, you know, back in those days, family members weren't allowed to get close to the person. And out in Ohio, a nurse risked her job by violating that, dressing my cousin's wife up in a hazmat suit and letting her come in and stay with him as he passed away. And I think that kind of signifies the importance of first responders, and that's kind of where I got the idea that we should have a first responders park. The other thing that generated the idea is that over in West Bridgewater, they have a 9/11 park, which is near the police station. And I always thought that that was a good idea because unlike a park with swing sets and slides, it's a memorial park. It's a place where people can go and sit and reflect, either on, you know, the terrible day of 9/11 or just to go and think about things quietly. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a memorial park. And the memorial park is going to be one of the very first in Massachusetts about the COVID epidemic. Mm-hmm. There have been a couple of Eagle Scout projects in other parts of the country that have done memorials, but from our research, we're going to be one of the first in Massachusetts.
So what is the proposal at the town meeting on Monday, May 20th?
The proposal comes about from about a 2.5-year process. Back in 2022, the Board of Selectmen decided that this was an idea worth pursuing, so they established a large committee. It includes members of the Recreation Commission, the Disability Americans with Disability Commission, Historical Commission, et cetera, and the sort of our most obvious honorees, which would be the police and fire chiefs, were both members of this. So we started off with a simple idea of having a monument with a circle around it so that people could have pavers and maybe some kind of a water feature, like a fountain or something like that. And then the folks from Furnace Village said, well, what about honoring our history as well as the two things? So the idea grew a little bit, grew much too large. And the initial proposal was to spend over $1 million on this park. Now, part of the problem is parks are expensive. And I'll tell you some numbers in a few minutes. But that was clearly unacceptable. So what we've done is we've spent most of the last year paring down the proposal so that we've cut it down from about $1.3 million to the request that you'll see at town meeting for $698,000.
Wow, that was quite a...
Yeah, we worked really hard on that, and lots of things disappeared. It turns out that a water feature is just a money gobbler because of all the infrastructure that's needed to keep a fountain going. Mm-hmm. We also worked very closely with the DPW, who was very good about suggestions, saying, we have a very small, hardworking DPW force for our numerous landscapes and cemeteries. And so they were pushing for a design that would be easy to maintain. Mm-hmm. And that impacted some of the simplifying the landscaping.
Sure, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So getting back to this idea of a memorial park, first one for the COVID crisis. It's not the first one in Easton, however. We already have a memorial park. And it was built in the 1880s, right outside of Oak Ames Memorial Hall. We call it the Rockery. It was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And it was the very first project that the CPC funded back in 2002. And at that time, with CPC money and the support of the National Park Service, we spent almost $300,000 on that little tiny swath of land. And if you looked at that in 2023 numbers, it would be closer to $500,000. So the more you wait, the more it is. But we do have a tradition of memorial parks. And that park became the heart of a neighborhood.
Right. And so is the Furnace Village neighborhood, are they going to have, what sorts of ideas that they contributed are going to be incorporated into the park?
That's a good question. And we're going to have a series of stone walls that line the pathways. And some of them are going to be about 3 feet high. And they're there for 2 reasons. It gives people a chance to sit on them for events that take place in the park. And it also serves as a break for runaway children so that little kids can't run into the street. They'd be blocked by 2 sets of stone walls. But at one point, the stone wall will be 6 feet tall. And inside there will be an inscription to the first responders. And flanking it on either side will be engravings of various instances of the history of the park, the cannonballs, the guys marching off to the war, the Industrial Revolution, and anything else that the neighborhood can come up with. And that's
Well, that sounds great.
Yeah, it should be fun. It should be beautiful. It should be a place that many people who come through the neighborhood, there's a lot of bicyclists that go through there every weekend to enjoy. We're also hoping, despite the cost of water, to put in a bubbler so that people who are riding through can refill their Yetis, and would also serve as a trailhead for all the conservation land that's in back of the property. So it's being funded 90% by CPC funds, and the Board of Selectmen asked us on the Swiss Park Memorial Committee to fund 10% of it through voluntary donations, which we're just beginning to get started. We've got people that have already signed up for pavers, and we've had a number of people that are doing some of the upper levels of sponsorship.
We can post at the end of this interview information so that people can donate a paver. How much does it cost?
So a paver is $300, but you get 230 characters, which are going to be 1 foot by 1 foot pavers.
Wow.
I told you that John Ventresco is the person who understands this. Well, they let me look at the circle on the original plan, and I counted out the squares, and the squares totaled up to 50 possible pavers. So then I realized the number of square feet that there were there. There's 900 square feet in the circle, so 1 foot pavers, room for 900 pavers. So the map wasn't the territory, as they say. So we have room for a lot of pavers, and I'm committed to. It's fun to hear on social media that this is a project for the developers in the neighborhood, and I'm the person who came up with this idea, and I'm as broke as anybody in town. But I'm putting in for 5 pavers because I want to honor a number of people. Obviously, my cousin who passed away, but also there are 4 historians from Furnace Village, because Furnace Village has always been super involved in their history. So I'm going to do a paver for those 4, 3 of whom are gone and 1 still with us. And then I'm going to do one for a secret group of first responders, which are my pets.
Which is your what?
My pets. I believe pets are first responders.
Oh,
And so I do want to make that point, and then there's room for a couple of others as well. So
I see. Wow, that's wonderful contribution.
Well, it's not a wonderful contribution, but it's something. If you have space to honor people that usually don't get honors, I think it's wonderful.
It's important, right?
Yeah.
So, viewers out there, if you have people that you want to honor, not just those who have passed from COVID, but also first responders and family and friends, either in Easton or from afar, please take note of the information at the end of this interview on how you can contribute to this wonderful Swift Park.
Yeah, we're putting together a website so that people can download the form, and I'll leave that to the folks at Town Hall. It'll be through the Town Hall website,
I see. Okay, good.
A couple of things that I'd like to emphasize is this is a relatively small park. It's 1/3 of an acre, which is the same size as my house lot, and so that's relatively small. But it's a good-sized park for its purpose. It's about the same size as we have down here at the Rockery. And one of the things we want to do, as you may know, is help build the neighborhood. Recently, town meeting and the members of Furnace Village agreed to change the zoning down there. For many, many years, it was strictly residential with a very high emphasis on preserving the history. It's a National Register Historic District. And everybody there was very proud of that. In fact, I was there as a young whippersnapper 50 years ago, putting up the sign that honored the idea of this was now a National Register district.
I don't think most people realize that. Certainly I didn't.
No, we don't. And we tend to forget that National Register designation. It means that somebody in Washington is aware that this was important and knows the reason, which was the Revolutionary War. We probably should upgrade it to talk more about the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, Easton has a number of National Register districts, basically that only there's two things that can advantageously help a neighborhood. Number one, if federal funds become available for for historic purposes, National Register districts are sort of first in line. Second of all, if there is a project that uses federal funds and even state funds, it has to be assessed in light of the importance of the historic district. So our new zoning regulations are attempting to push through new growth through things like multiple use residences and mixed use residences where there's a business on one floor and houses on another. Some of that's going to be controversial for the people in the neighborhood because it's a big change. But having a park that reestablishes the heart of this neighborhood, because Swift's Park was the heart. There was a bandstand there back in the day and all of this sort of stuff. It's like the Rockery for this neighborhood. It'd be a place for them to gather and go.
Well, the other thing that comes to mind is when you mention cannonballs, the Historical Society has a wonderful collection of those cannonballs in all different sizes.
Yes. Yeah, what happened was they had to test the cannons to make sure that they weren't going to blow up. And 50 years ago, the foundry was still in operation, and they actually made a few cannons for reenacting units. And basically in those days, they used this giant magnet to find out if there were any flaws, called magnafluxing. But back in the Revolutionary War, the only way to test a cannon was to overload it and fire it.
Oh my.
And what they did is they fired it up over Old Pond into a mound. And over the years, people have found cannonballs of all the different sizes up there. And some metal detectors have even found some of the cannons that didn't make it.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. A lot of those were taken away in the Depression because you could sell the iron back then. But bits and pieces have been found. So, yeah, it's a legitimate historic neighborhood for sure. And we're going to emphasize that with this memorial wall idea.
So who was do we know who the writer was, the Revolutionary War writer who, I mean, it wasn't Paul Revere, but it had to be somebody among his pals that came to the foundry and said, okay, guys, saddle up, we're going to Lexington.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a story attached to that. There was a thing for the bicentennial where the research was done on the writers that came out from Boston. So I think you could find that name if you wanted to. But that wasn't the guy that came down to the foundry. The way we know about this story is that one of the people there lived long enough, and in those days you had to live into the 1830s in order to get a pension. So in order to get a pension, nobody had any identification numbers. So they would go around to their neighbors and collect up stories. He served in this regiment, blah, blah, blah. And we know that somebody came down to the foundry dressed in a militia officer's uniform, and it was remembered by Unite Keith, the pensioner, 8-year-old brother. So who would come down? Well, the most likely candidate would have been Josiah Keith, who had a tavern at Five Corners and was the leader of this end of the town's militia company. And even though they were relatives, I think the 8-year-old boy was so starstruck by the uniform he didn't remember the name of the person who came down. So that's the story. And then
that is so fascinating.
Yeah, and
is that in Chafin's book?
No, it isn't. One of the great sources that is now online are these pension records. So you can look up anybody who applied for a pension, and you find these stories. We found a story this year about an African American resident of Easton who came home on furlough, married a fellow African American, and they went back to the war. So she became a Molly Pitcher. She became somebody who was serving as an assistant. They would be called laundresses because that was their biggest job, was washing the clothes. Men wouldn't wash clothes.
Was this in the Revolutionary War?
Revolutionary War. And
so we had African Americans living in Easton.
Yes, we did. Relatively small number, but a very high percentage of people serving. And he served, died shortly after the Revolution in 1786, and said to his wife, "Now, if you don't get married again, because you'll lose your pension." He was confident that a pension would somehow appear. And she finally was able to apply for it and get it. So,
wow.
Yeah.
How do you dig up these stories, Ed?
Well, it's kind of my job. And that's why I think, to me, Swift's Park is such a important project, because it will give people a place where they can remember these stories. There'll be pictures.
Right.
And, pictures are worth 1,000 words.
Right.
And
so they'll be engraved into the stone.
Yeah. There's a couple of ways to do that. The least expensive way is to engrave and then paint the engraving with black paint so that it'll stand out like a silhouette.
Right.
If you've been to Washington, D.C., and man, we've looked at a number of memorials all over the country. But Washington, D.C., the Korean War Memorial is engraving, but it's a laser engraving that's very, very expensive to do. This little park, we had the designer of the landscape at the Shovel Works, who's a super duper person to work with and really knows her stuff. But we based the design on Maya Lin's little park. Again, a small park. Small parks are very very common these days, and unfortunately they're expensive. But it's based on a park down in Providence, Newport, Rhode Island, that has stone walls. And one of the things we were hoping to put sort of miniature versions of a blast furnace and things like that. And that went the way of budget cuts as well. So,
sure. Well, we only have about a minute left. So let's hear your pitch for people coming to town meeting on Monday to vote.
Well, everybody should come to town meeting because it's important. This is our annual town meeting. There's a number of CPC projects coming up, and one of them relates to Swift's Park. Swift's Park is, something that the folks in the neighborhood want, something that I would really like to see, because Easton is a big town and can certainly stand to have 2 memorial parks. So come, you can take a look at the project online, and hopefully you'll be able to donate after it gets chosen by town meeting.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way to remember family and friends.
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you so much, Ed, for being my guest today and giving us all that historical background. Many of our viewers are not familiar with much of that history, but reading the Reverend Chafin's book, History of Easton, is also a wonderful resource for those who are newcomers and those of us who are townies. I'm still reading it, and some of us are still rereading it. So join us on Monday, May 20th, 7 o'clock at the All Frames High School for the annual town meeting. And please pay special attention to the Conservation Preservation Committee's recommendations and support those with your vote. Thank you so much for watching. Priscilla Almquist Olsen. This has been a wonderful interview. Thank you again, Ed Hands, town historian. And until next time, be well.
Community Forum is sponsored by the Easton Grange 196 and a friend of Yardley Wood Rink and the Easton Lions Club.